Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
I routinely encounter these arguments with or from pro-abortionists that just like radically misunderstand or just ignore like what actually somebody like you could Google for 5 minutes and understand some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. Not all of it, but some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. Like you can know what pro-life people think. It's out there. And yet there's this meme where like, you know, the guy is just standing in an empty room and then he hangs like a red curtain and paints flames on it. And he like makes these cardboard cutouts of demons and like writes different names like racist and fascist on them. And then he just lies in the room like in the fetal position, weeping and rocking himself to sleep. And it is, right. I mean, it's like, so they do that. And then, right. And then they take out their swords and they're like, haha, I have destroyed the evil racist fascist, like homophobe that lives in my imagination. And yeah, it's quite amusing. And it's a function, I think, of owning so many major media outlets and like educational institutions that you really don't ever have to encounter somebody that just sort of does, you know, in goodwill, like disagrees. Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable Weekly Publishers and Editors podcast from the American Mind. I'm your host, features editor Spencer Clavin, and it's a two-hander again today. I'm joined by managing editor Seth Barron. The rest of us are scattered to the four winds. Actually, we all just got back. Seth and I both just got back from visiting the Publius Fellowship, which was a blast. It was a good time to see everybody and also to meet the young up-and-comers of the conservative movement. Really fun. One of my favorite parts of Claremont, what Claremont does. My second year, Seth's first, I think. Seth, did you have a good time?
Yeah, I did. I'm very impressed. I think we've got a good, I don't know, what do you call it? Like backbench,
Yeah.
Moving up the ranks.
Sure.
I think in 20 years, we're going to have a very vital, intelligent, and, committed cadre.
Absolutely.
Fighting away, right?
Absolutely. They've read so much, not just for the fellowship, but they're very well read and, spirited, lots of chutzpah. And yeah, Chris Caldwell leaned over to me. He said, "Were you ever a Publius Fellow?" And I said, "No, I was not." And he said, "You'd be a lot smarter if you were." And I said, "You're telling me." So that was lots of fun. And now we're back to do a little cleanup. Somebody tweeted at us, a friend, Thad on Twitter, tweeted at us saying, "It's always funny that the Roundtable's a weekly podcast, but it can still be miles behind the news cycle because things move so damn quickly." And this is definitely one of those times. We record on Wednesdays, comes out on Thursdays. And on Friday, of course, the Supreme Court released its decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. It's a much anticipated decision, not only because of the subject matter, which is abortion and overturning Roe and Casey, but also because this is a leaked decision, an unprecedented leak that kind of gave us a peek at the thing beforehand. Possibly, although we don't know, in an effort to incite political violence or at least to, gin up anger on the left, because, as it turns out, wonder of wonders, this thing actually does overturn both Roe and Casey. Mississippi's law banning abortion after 15 weeks will stand. That's before viability. Viability is the line that Roe and Casey and their progeny drew, and now that is no longer the case. There is no right to abortion in the Constitution. This has been cause for some rejoicing on multiple levels, I would say. We published a little statement about it over at the American Mind, so you can read kind of the editor's take on it. But there's obviously at least two dimensions to this. One is the actual, life of unborn children, which is probably of paramount importance. The question of their humanity, of their personhood, and of their inclusion in the Declaration's promises that all men are created equal and endowed with the right to life. It's very moving, at least to me, to consider that. Well, first of all, it's very, it was very a source of great dismay to me to think that promise was being belied by the abortion industrial complex and the abortion regime in this country. And therefore, it's very moving to me to consider that, maybe someday we won't have to feel that way. It's, on that level, at least, people make a lot of comparisons between abortion and slavery, some of them apt, some of them less apt, in my opinion. But on this level, at least, there is a real analogy that the issue, the philosophical issue, boils down to who is a man, what is a person, what is a human being. And so it's very moving to me to consider that, the door is at least open to answering that question in the affirmative for the unique genetic individuals that come into being at conception. This is, to me, surely a win. Just a big W all around for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, of course, there's the sort of procedural or constitutional questions, which Roe, famously one of the aides to Blackmun who wrote Roe said something to the effect of, this doesn't even pretend to be a constitutional law argument. And that's really true. I mean, this was a naked usurpation of power, as Alito points out in his majority decision. The Roe decision sort of ends with a list of regulations or guidelines for what can and can't be done legally on abortion, and it looks a lot like the courts making laws, the courts writing laws in a manner that is only appropriate for the legislature to do. And so we may get into, the Supreme Court may or may not have a role in determining who is a person, although the justices declined to make that determination in this ruling. But at a constitutional level, of course, millions and millions of people felt from 1973 on that they simply had not been given a voice in this national debate of crucial significance. And this was, in many ways, the origin of the pro-life movement. Is the March on Life, a year after Roe v. Wade began to convene in D.C. every year. And at first, they wanted Congress to do something about this. They thought this ought to be something that our legislatures, whom we have elected, can resolve. And Roe made a mockery of that too. Roe said that no, in fact, it was the court that got to decide this, and never mind the opinions or the beliefs of Americans. So this is now something that will be kicked back to the states. There will be much discussion to come, I think, about whether it should ultimately be an issue of federalism, or whether some federal law or even constitutional amendment ought to be the new goal of the pro-life movement. Of course, always with exceptions for the extreme cases, which were already, as we've said before on this podcast, there were already exceptions in place, even in the laws that were being struck down by Roe. But before we kind of start talking about the consequence of this, the fallout from this, we wanted also to mention that this is not the only major bombshell decision in this Supreme Court junket. This sort of season of decisions has furnished a ton of different rulings on very significant issues. There's one on gun rights, right? New York Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which came out a little earlier. This was Justice Thomas, writing a pro gun rights decision, which we can also discuss. There's one other one that, we didn't talk about yet. Kennedy, I don't think, versus Bremerton School District. I haven't mentioned that yet on this episode, and that's the one in which there's Joseph Kennedy, the petitioner, lost his job as a high school football coach in the Bremerton School District for kneeling at midfield after games to offer a personal prayer. And people can join him if they want, but it wasn't required. And this too was upheld. It was decided that that's, of course, as it should be, perfectly permissible. There's been a major freak out about this, that, now there's going to be, people can do Muslim prayer if they want at schools, and maybe people can even Jews can do prayers at school. It's amazing to me that that's the left. The left is trying to freak the right out by saying, well, now that you've acknowledged that the Establishment Clause doesn't prohibit the free exercise of religion even in public places. Well, just imagine the boogeyman, that there might be cries of Allahu Akbar at the games. And this is sort of akin to me to people who say, well, now that you've outlawed or made it possible to outlaw abortion, then men are going to have to be responsible for the babies that they sire. And so a lot of conservatives on Twitter right now are doing the "your terms are acceptable" meme. You really kind of got it. We call that marriage, and we're glad that you've picked up the plot. In any case, these are momentous decisions signaling a real robust commitment, at least to defending the a traditional conservative understanding and reading of the Bill of Rights, if not going as far as perhaps someone like our friend Hadley Arkes might have liked. You can read him at The American Mind First Thing saying that really this personhood ought to be established by the court. But that's in some sense a question for another day, or at least it is now that the ruling is out. But what's not a question for another day is yet another Supreme Court decision that could yet come out. People haven't really been talking about this one this much because there have been so many other things to discuss. But West Virginia versus the EPA is a case. Basically, two coal companies have joined up with the state of West Virginia to sue the EPA for imposing an Obama-era program, the Clean Power Plan, which they argue is an abuse of power and undue burden. And if the court agrees with them, then we could be opening the door to some serious reevaluation, revisitation of just what the administrative state can and can't do, which would be hugely disruptive, in fact, to what we call sometimes the deep state. Would be a real sort of transformation of a lot of the kind of transfers of power that have happened since the progressive era. So I don't know, man. I'm getting a little tired of all this winning. Seth, what's your experience been of both these cases and of the reaction?
Well, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I thought it's the left that does these long marches through the institutions in order to achieve like victory after like 50 years. But evidently the right can do it too. I mean, this is like a victory for the Federalist Society, I guess, isn't it? And the Right to Life movement. They pushed this like steadily. I mean, I have to say, a few years ago, I never really would have thought that they were going to overturn Roe versus Wade.
I don't think we believed it even after the leak. I mean, I think most people were like, that can't be.
Right. Which is kind of amazing. It occurred to me, like, I remember when I was a kid. Now, my parents were liberals, and, I sort of wanted to be like a liberal when I was like, I'm talking about being quite small, like 8 or 9. And to me, like, when I first heard about abortion, I sort of assumed that was something that Republicans liked because it sounded so mean.
Oh, wow.
And I said, I was like, oh, like they want to kill babies. My parents were like, no, it's actually the other. I mean, my parents weren't doctrinaire or whatever, but they were kind of more like anarchistic or whatever. But they were like, no, it's the Republicans who are against it. I was like, oh. Anyway, it's a big deal. I wonder what you think about let me go through a few things, but I'm curious about, like, Alito was very, very particular in his decision to say this is like, this substantive due process issue really only applies to Roe and Casey because it's the question of, another life. And he made a big point, I believe, of exempting cases like Griswold or Obergefell or Loving versus Virginia. Whereas Clarence Thomas very specifically said, no, now it's time to go and undo, Griswold. And people are really freaking out about Clarence Thomas at this point. And everyone's like jumping in. It's all this tu quoque stuff, right? Like, well, now you're going to get your own. Now they're going to come and undo your marriage.
Right.
They're going to come and do that to you. But it's like, well, he's the one who did it. So I'm not so I don't see how that's going to happen. The rage against Clarence Thomas,
right, is
amazing. Now, I think sometimes people like Clarence Thomas who as he put it, went through a high-tech lynching, like, what was it, 35 years ago? 30 years ago. I think they become, like, so hardened to it that they begin to almost take delight in the excoriation and, like, just being, like, savage and becoming, like, a focus of hate.
Yeah.
Like, I think he doesn't care at all. I think it kind of it makes him stronger.
Yeah, there's a total honey badger aspect.
Yes. But, like, I don't know if you saw, like, the Lori Lightfoot was screaming, like, F. Clarence Thomas, and
Right.
George Takei was saying he's a clown in blackface or something like that.
Oh, you can find worse screenshots than that, my friend. I mean,
Oh,
not
I
from the
know, I
biggest,
know.
yeah, right.
Oh,
But
crazy
totally,
stuff like some Canadian pollster
yeah.
saying that he's like a he's just another dumb field hand. But
I feel
obviously
actually, I feel a certain embarrassment even quoting some of them. Like I was thinking of a couple as you were talking, and I'm not going to say that on the podcast.
no, why should I? It's not I didn't come up with it.
Yeah.
Let them delete their own tweets. So that's interesting. That's very interesting. I think there are still a lot of questions that are going to have to be worked out. Like I've seen some interviews. Like I asked you about this, and I don't feel like you gave me a very satisfactory answer. And I don't think there is a satisfactory answer to this question, which is people routinely do IVF treatments where they fertilize like 10 or 12 eggs.
Right.
Or maybe more. I don't really know. And a bunch of them are frozen. Now, these are like, very rudimentary beings, whatever. They're like 8 or 16 cells, I guess. And they're frozen. So are these like human beings in the sense that we have to keep them frozen? Like, what is the status of these like, clumps of cells as it were? I mean, I've heard some pro-life activists being asked about this, and they kind of duck the question, which I think you'd have to, because what are you going to do? Are you going to say, well, now we have to figure out a way to like implant them somewhere, and so that's one thing. No,
Totally.
what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that it's totally a valid question. It's one of those hard cases. I think that you sort of have to ask when does something become a human question first, and then like reason from there about what to do. And like, yeah, there might be some. I mean, look, I have friends who and even loved ones who came into being through IVF, so it's like difficult to say that was a bad thing that happened. But at the same time, there are people who are kind of like, I mean, and who knows where science is going. Like, there are people who are working on right now, like one at a time IVF, and like what that, it might be that the pro-life movement has to sort of make that a priority in the same way that it's made adoption a big, supporting people through adoption into a priority, as it realized that was an implication of its view. But you're right. I mean, like there's tons of stuff that, like, once you answer the question one way or another, you have to work it out from there.
Right. But maybe those are the kind of limited, like, I don't know, horizon cases that aren't, exceptions that prove a rule. Like, it's not really the point. I mean, in the same way that the left won't stop talking about rape, incest, and the health of the life of the mother, when, okay, those are perhaps valid points and have to be worked out, but they comprise like a tiny fraction.
Well, right. I mean,
abortions, right?
Exactly. And to me, there's this question that I mentioned of, well, is the pro-life movement now going to adopt the strategy of making abortion illegal in every state by state? Or is it going to take this to Congress and try to get a constitutional amendment or a federal law? And to me, if the federal law approach turns out to be the one that we pursue, you're still dealing with something that, look, most states have slightly different laws on murder. Like, they are empowered, even in the context of it being understood that murder is illegal nationwide. Like, each state is kind of empowered to work out the marginal questions on its own. And so even those edge cases that we've been talking about forever, the rape cases, that sort of thing. I mean, even if there's a national approach to this, it seems like that's exactly the sort of thing that a state legislature would be in charge of kind of determining and asking. And similarly with the IVF thing, right? These are these edge cases or these extreme cases that challenge basically any approach that you take to it. And yeah, why wouldn't you put those specifically in the hands of the state?
Now, you know a lot more about this than I do, but what is the status of life of the mother? Because I kind of, is that a red herring when people talk about how even in the case of life of the mother, you don't want an exemption. But I mean, how many times does someone come in, like a dying woman come in, and they're like, "Yep, she has to die."
Right. Well, I mean, of course, in the wake of the decision, there were people on Instagram sharing like long screen caps of tweet threads about, horror stories, nightmare stories. My mother, was before Roe, my mother had this terribly threatening pregnancy, and they wouldn't terminate it until like the very last minute. She almost died. And, any person with a beating heart understands that this world presents incredibly tragic exigencies. And the pro-life case is just that you're dealing with two lives, and that sometimes in extreme cases, you have to make decisions between one life or another. And that's like a horrifying fact about the way the world works, that you don't eliminate that problem by making up the imaginary story that the baby's not a life. You just basically look away from the question. And so, yeah, like, I do not think that anybody is saying what we want is a situation in which the doctor is going to like not abort a baby in a case of like preeclampsia that has advanced to the point where it's the mother or the baby. Like I just don't think I think that is a red herring, much like the whole ectopic pregnancy thing, which is a totally separate question that doesn't even actually involve an abortion from the pro-life side. It involves like basically a disorder that has to be terminated. Anyway, like, yeah, all of this is to say, like, I come back again to the fact that what you're up against is a question: are you dealing with a person or not? Where does a person come into being? Where's a human come into being? And once that question has been admitted, and once we've kind of resolved it in a way that makes sense, and the pro-life position or my position is that it only makes sense to answer that question with the moment of conception, and that once you've made that decision, then you are faced with all sorts of, edge cases and tragic problems, because we live in a world that presents all sorts of tragic and complicated situations. But like, again, as you say, those are the vanishing minority of most.
Right. I mean, I don't know if we talked about this last week, but I have seen this new meme or this new theme, this idea that getting rid of Roe v. Wade, like the Dobbs decision, is a violation of the free exercise of religion of Jews, because
right.
According to the Jewish religion, abortion is not just an option, but is mandatory in the event of like the mother's, to save the life of the mother. Now, we just went over like, yeah, well, that's already kind of built in, like the life of the mother. But there's something about the way that they make this appeal. Like they're like, leave your Christian laws off of my uterus because I'm Jewish, and I have it's all like the idea that because this option is in there, perhaps questionably, that therefore the Jewish religion demands abortion, or it's not really the Jewish religion, which is like, sounds like something from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Like it sounds like some kind of like insane, or like, the murder of Hugh of Lincoln. It sounds like some kind of insane blood libel that all of these like extremely progressive Jews are now parroting, thinking that it's like very clever.
Well, it's so fascinating because like, well, for one thing, right, as I think we did discuss a while back, like, even kind of like crazy people like me who think that the Establishment Clause is not a separation of church and state, but an Establishment Clause which says don't choose a sect for the whole country. Even I will say that like you can outlaw things even if a religion prescribes them, as long as you're not outlawing them because you want to chase that religion out of the country, like widow burning or polygamy. Right. Or,
I don't know, Aztec child sacrifice. I mean, all these kinds of things.
Exactly. But then the other thing is like they do this with Christianity too, actually, where there's a sort of an analog to this that, before anybody knew anything about like genetics and before ultrasound existed, there was this concept of the quickening, right? The moment where you can feel the baby moving in the womb. And so people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas have these elaborate sort of discussions of like, well, Aquinas sort of thought that in a philosophically valid but not biologically true way, he thought that like the three different parts of the soul come respectively from the Father, the Mother, and God, and that like when the soul is complete, that's when the baby is a human, right? And that didn't take place until the quickening occurred, or whatever. I mean, I'm probably butchering his argument, and so they cite this as if like, you know, Aquinas therefore would be in favor of abortions up until the point that you feel the baby moving in the womb, which is just like, again, to mistake the question that pro-lifers are asking. Like, this is the thing that gets me. It's like, at least understand how pro-lifers are approaching this whole issue. And that is, we are asking, when does life begin? And it seems to me as if like science basically has revealed that the only philosophically consistent place to answer that question is a conception. And then all the other things that you rightly say are, you know, will raise complications. Like, you answer that in light of that question.
Yeah, and I've actually seen the same arguments being made about Islam. Like the Quran says, like around 120 days is when God breathes life, like breathes the soul into the embryo, and at that point, it's like becomes a full person. But you know, it's interesting. Christopher Hitchens was an atheist. But I saw a funny clip of his recently where he was saying like that, like unquestionably, an unborn child is a human being. Like you can't, like even the way we talk about it. And he made reference to like looking at like ultrasound images.
Yeah.
And I wonder, is this, you know, has technology and the ability to peer into the womb, and it's just available to every pregnant woman and everyone who like follows them on Facebook to see what a baby looks like when it's really, really early in its gestation. To what extent has that changed the popular tenor, the popular sentiment about abortion? Because now we have these amazing ways to look inside, this amazing imaging that very early, like people can see, oh, it really is a formed. It doesn't look like a tadpole at 12 weeks or whatever. Do you think that's like changed the way people feel about it?
To me, this is such a fascinating question, and the answer is like yes, in ways that we can't even fathom. I mean, what's really interesting about Roe is that it makes mention in passing of the fact that the American Medical Association, long before Roe, met and convened about abortion to say, we think that most people don't understand what's involved. And if they knew that they were killing a child, they would immediately oppose and want to criminalize this act. But because they still hold on to these antiquated notions like that of the quickening, for instance, they basically, you know, they don't see what science is discovering. And the pro-life movement begins even before Roe, you know, with the Wilkies and this the abortion handbook, the handbook on abortion. And this is this Catholic couple, and their whole thing is to show those images that still are, you know, a major part of kind of driving this point home to people, because, you know, you can make the case that there's a unique genetic code in this. Whatever you call it, this embryo, this zygote, you know, from day one, but you can't really like show to people what that means until you have this amazing imagery to see like plainly this is a creature that is coming into human form, and it's coming inexorably into human form. And so, yeah, weirdly, the kind of abortion extremist case is anti-science. And you see this in the way they talk. They constantly obscure the scientific nature of what they're discussing by reducing it to, you know, the heartbeat is just an electrical stimulus, right? You know, so fetal heartbeat's not really a human heartbeat. Your heartbeat is also so is mine, right? Like, we are all clumps of cells, very complicated clumps of cells. And so, right, this sort of thing is crucial. And it's why I think like somebody like Hitchens, and he's not alone, there's so many secular pro-lifers. I mean, there's like a lot of people who have no interest in imposing any sort of theocracy, even in their home, let alone in the country, but just can't look away from the logic of like, if you believe a person is a morally important entity with certain rights, then there's only really one conclusion you can draw about what's in a mother's womb.
Well, that's why I was interested a year or so ago, maybe during the presidential election, when Pete Buttigieg, the devout Christian, he very kind of sententiously was like, life begins at breath.
That's literally like a kind of Stone Age, like, the nshama, like the sort of it's like
but there's so many ways in which the left pretends to be the party of science, yet just ignores science. I mean, the whole thing about women. I mean, we hear there's two strains of discourse going on right now. One in which we talk about chest feeders and women with penises and all of this stuff, and people who swim well.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, we hear about women. They don't want to give up the category of women so quickly when it still has all of this like political valence when we're talking about like abortion. So it's pretty interesting. But regarding that other case that you mentioned, the gun case in New York, if you don't mind me just switching gears over to that.
No, I hope you will, because it's the one that I sort of know least about, and I know this is your area. So yes.
Well, it's only my area because I'm in New York and I follow this. But in New York, it's very difficult to get a license to get a gun, get a handgun, much less carry one. The case that was before the court involved two people who had permits to have a gun at home. And they wanted to be able to carry them for self-defense, just for self-defense. The way New York, in particular New York City, works is that you have to argue special cause for being allowed to carry a handgun. Across the country, there's basically two types of states regarding concealed carry. There's shall issue states, where the state has to issue it if you apply for it, and they can have qualifications and various requirements, or may issue. And New York has been a may issue state. The Supreme Court essentially eliminated the special cause burden. They said it was too burdensome, and that anyone who has a gun at home must also be allowed to carry it. Now, the Democrats in New York City and state went crazy about this and said it's going to turn into the wild, wild west, and that this is going to, encourage people just to carry guns everywhere. But it's kind of a red herring, because the Supreme Court isn't changing the rules regarding gun permitting like at home, right? The states can still make it as difficult as they want, or pretty difficult to get a gun.
Mm-hmm.
So, and here's the thing: like in 1993, the NYPD estimated that there were 2 million illegal guns floating around New York City.
Holy crow!
And
how many people are these days in New York City? Do you know?
About 8.5 million.
So it's like a fourth of the people if you have one illegal gun to each person.
I guess.
Wow. Okay.
But at the same time, the NYPD provides fiscal permits to only 40,000. It has like 40,000 permits.
Right.
So, we're dealing with a 50-to-1 ratio. So basically, here's the thing: is Eric Adams and Kathy Hochul, the governor, they would prefer to blame the Supreme Court for all of New York City's problems than to deal with like the issues of proactive policing, stop and frisk, judges who let people go who are arrested for illegal gun possession, prosecutors who won't prosecute it. So all I'm saying is that it's unlikely that it's going to lead to a massive uptick in crime, which we're already experiencing.
So there's a version of the your terms are acceptable counter argument to this one too, which is that I've seen a bunch of libs being like, well, are you conservatives really ready for like a bunch of black people to own guns? Like, there's a lot of black people in New York, and now they can own guns. And it's like, they really think that there's like a single conservative out there being like, yes, what I'm worried about is black people legally owning guns. Like, I would like to say on this podcast that I would like as many black people to legally own guns as could buy, black, white, whatever. Everybody should own a gun. But the thing where, yeah, I mean, they think that we are genuinely concerned about those 2 million illegal guns because like some of them are in the hands of black people, as opposed to the fact that all of them are in the hands of criminals, which is like, but let me ask you this. I mean, it seemed as if this was a kind of blow for gun rights, maybe in a slightly broader way than just, right. Of course, New York can still make it difficult to to own a gun legally. They don't, the real problem is with actually, policing and so forth. But are there implications for this more broadly across the country?
I think so, because it establishes that, there's this big argument. What are guns for? Like, are guns for hunting? Are guns for, resisting tyranny? Well, Clarence Thomas makes it pretty clear that, one major purpose for guns is self-defense. And if the state sees fit to let you have a gun in the house, there's no reason why you shouldn't be allowed to carry it for self-defense. And I think that's an important precedent. I'm about as much of an expert on Second Amendment law as I am on the pro-life question. But it does seem like it's it is a major step forward for our side. And by the way, what you were saying about your terms are acceptable.
Right.
The left is so frequently having arguments with like itself, like it erects these straw men and then burns them, and thinks that it's like achieved something, that it's beaten us,
totally.
As though like they create this figment of what the right wing thinks, then they baffle it and they think that they've won. Right, exactly. Oh, do you realize that more black people will be born if we get rid of abortions? Yeah, we knew that. Are you aware that black people could own guns? Yes, we understand that black people own guns too. I mean, they keep doing this with every topic. It's like really, it's kind of funny.
It is funny. I mean, I maybe this is deluded of me, but I feel as if, at least with the abortion stuff, I feel as if I understand quite precisely the nature of the pro-abortion side. I understand even why, some of their concerns started to be raised during the 60s, and I get the history of second wave feminism and whatever. Maybe there would be some finer points that I could be educated on by a really smart pro-abortion person, but whatever. I feel like I know what I'm arguing against and why. I routinely encounter these arguments with or from pro-abortionists that just like radically misunderstand or just ignore like what actually somebody like you could Google for 5 minutes and understand some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. Not all of it, but some of the stuff we were talking about earlier. Like, you can know what pro-life people think. It's out there. And yet there's this meme where like, the guy is just standing in an empty room and then he hangs like a red curtain and paints flames on it. And he like makes these cardboard cutouts of demons and like writes different names like racist and fascist on them. And then he just lies in the room, like in the fetal position, weeping and rocking himself to sleep. And it is, right. I mean, it's like, so they do that. And then they take out their swords and they're like, haha, I have destroyed the evil racist fascist, like homophobe that lives in my imagination. And yeah, it's quite amusing. And it's a function, I think, of owning so many major media outlets and like educational institutions that you really don't ever have to encounter somebody that just sort of does, in goodwill, like disagrees with you. I don't know.
I think that's right. Let me ask you, since you say you feel like you understand the history and the debate pretty well. I read an interesting piece by Steve Saylor this week.
Okay.
About early Protestant Republican support for abortion. It was Ronald Reagan who signed into law the first expansive legal abortion regime.
Right.
And of the seven Supreme Court justices who voted for Roe v. Wade, a bunch of them were Republican appointees.
Yeah,
And
Blackmun was a Nixon appointee. I mean, that was
right. And Saylor makes this point that it all goes back to a debate that pretty much faded from view about 60 years ago, which was the Catholic versus Protestant, split.
Yeah.
And that essentially, like, the Protestant establishment thought it was ridiculous that, like, some sober Republican doctor should be overruled by some, like, Italian woman's, like, ignorant priest on this sensible question of family planning. And that they kind of, that it was kind of even though that debate pretty much ended with Kennedy's assassination about, Catholics versus Protestants in political life, or maybe with his election, but that this was kind of like a holdover among, like, the sorts of people who were on the Supreme Court. And I just thought that was, like, a fascinating way to look at it. Yeah, I mean, even the Southern Baptist Convention, apparently in the early 70s, was pro. I mean, Steve Saylor says that the big surprise about the abortion debate is that evangelicals became so passionate about it.
What a fascinating take. I mean, so I have a lot of thoughts. One is, the fact that Blackmun's a Nixon appointee, the fact that Nixon himself, Nixon, was anti-abortion eventually, but as I understand it, it was not a big issue for him, and he kind of could have gone. Well, Trump too, right? Sort of saw that this was an important thing to his base and adopted it as his position. But that's totally true. And the fact that there was under Reagan and sort of enduring long after Reagan and long, I would say, after its usefulness, there was a strong sort of hyper-libertarian contingent in the conservative movement. And by hyper-libertarian, I guess I mean, not just like sort of we want a wide range of practices to flourish in various local communities in this country, and there are certain kind of decisions that the state does not make for you, but really just like, I'm okay, you're okay, you do you at every possible level. And like, I wonder to a certain extent whether that attitude, as contrasted with the kind of more state interventionist attitude, whether that mapped onto the kind of Protestant view of Catholics as these like moralists with this Pope that tells you what to do, and that in that way there was this kind of strain of just reflexive, less reasoned than reflexive, conservative thought, libertarian thought that said like, hey man, like why should the state get involved in this question? And the growing response, I think, on the right, especially in the new right, has been, well, there actually are some matters that it's appropriate for the state to decide on. You wouldn't want the state, unless you're extremely libertarian to the point of, antinomian anarchy, you wouldn't want the state to just throw up its hands about whether people can be murdered. Although some blue states are getting close, right? But like this sort of thing, this answer to that has basically, I think, united Protestants and Catholics who, plus the fact that Christianity in general is this sort of beleaguered and assaulted force in American life. And so we kind of banded together and forgot our differences. But there's also, I think, the real kind of eclipse of that libertarian thing, which in turn might have looked at this Catholic passion about it as being kind of too interventionist. I don't know. That's just a guess. And I also think that whole thing misunderstands drastically, like everybody in that, except for the real pro-lifers, like sort of misunderstood like what women's lib was actually about. Like by the time it got to Roe v. Wade, this was really like a cultural Marxist movement, women of the world unite. And its vision was very close to abolish the family. It was very close to just like release the human person from all biological and moral constraints. And I think that like if they had understood that, they might have gotten on board beforehand. But that's perhaps a story for another day. I don't know. Unless you have more stuff.
No.
Yeah. We got to get into. We've been this stuff. We could truly go on. There is one other thing that we both I think wanted to talk about though, and that is the January 6th hearings.
Yes.
There have been some new. I hesitate to call them revelations. I think you called them revelations in quotes to me over text message, which is about right. So, okay, where to begin? I mean, I'm going to ask you in a second to kind of like, I understand that you've been watching some of the hearings, so we don't have to. So in a second, I'm going to ask you to like grant us the benefit of your insight into these issues. But I did sort of tune in for this latest thing, which is this woman, Cassidy Hutchinson. She is, let's see, an aide, right? A 25-year-old aide to Mark Meadows, former chief of staff. And her bombshell revelation is that she claims Trump knew there were weapons in the crowd among those who were marching in D.C. on January 6th. And although mags, which are magnetic detectors, were in place to kind of confiscate these weapons, which included both guns, but also like, spears, it seems, and flagpoles, I heard. Trump said, for the people that are coming to hear me speak on the ellipse, take away the metal detectors and they can march from there, or something to that effect. And the big quote that I was listening to Rachel, for my sins as penance, I listened to Rachel Maddow discuss this, and she kept repeating this one quote from this girl, from this woman, I should say, that Trump said, "They're not here to hurt me," and they said it like, "They're not here to hurt me," right? As if Trump was sort of colluding to, well, they're here to hurt somebody else, wink, wink. But of course, I mean, to me, look, I'm no great fan of Trump's behavior on this day. I have plenty of criticisms of his sort of how he comported himself in the lead up to this event and afterward. But to me, that sounds obviously like what he was saying is, let him come to the speech. They're not here to hurt me. They're not trying to assassinate me. So let him come to the speech. So in any case, they're obviously building this up into a case to prosecute the guy, right? To put him in jail. And I just don't know if it'll matter so much that it's like obviously double hearsay in many cases and kind of much more heat than light. But I don't know. Seth, are there other things from the other parts of the hearing that you would like to share with us?
Well, I'm just so amazed by all of this. I mean, this testimony by this woman has been still cast as like this insane bombshell. This moment of total of like irrefutable proof. But everything about it, I mean, I even saw like the Washington Examiner had this editorial thing. Now they're I guess like a nominally conservative, like they're a never Trump publication, right? Basically.
By and large, yeah, I think so.
They're saying, okay, this testimony was like essentially unimpeachable evidence that Trump is a criminal. Right. But they have this one great way of putting it. They're like, this woman is like, I'm sorry, let me just drag this up. It was very funny. Here we go. Oh, yes. Hutchinson's resume alone should establish her credibility. The 25-year-old had already worked at the highest levels of conservative Republican politics, including in the offices of Senator Ted Cruz and House Minority Whip Steve Scalise, before becoming a top aide for Mark Meadows. Now, I'm sorry, like, no one who's 25 is at, like, the top levels of anything in, like, politics. Okay, yes, she was I assume, okay, it sounds like she worked for Mark Meadows. That's great. But having been in the office of Ted Cruz and Steve Scalise, yeah. I mean, what was she, as an intern? I mean, they have so many people working in these offices. The idea that her testimony is you can't indict. And I saw her on Jake Tapper, and Jake Tapper was kind of like, oh no, Jake Tapper was talking. She wasn't on Jake Tapper. What is it that she wasn't? Everything she said was hearsay, essentially. She has some claim that Trump tried to grab the steering wheel from the Secret Service.
Yeah, Dan Bongino, I mean, I don't really know. To me, that part just sounds truly, I could be wrong. That part sounds insane. And Dan Bongino, who, has experience in these areas, was pointing out that like the video shows him leaving in a different vehicle than she says he was in during that time. So I don't know. The whole thing, yeah, it's certainly not the ironclad. Let's put it that way.
But this is what I wanted to say is I really actually have not been watching very much of this, the hearings, but what I have seen is Adam Schiff on television, on CNN, saying, oh, I have incredible proof that Trump knew this and that, and he did this and that. Now, where have we heard that before? Oh, gee, I don't know. For the last 4 years, Adam Schiff was on these shows, and I'm sorry, Jamie Raskin saying the same stuff. Both of them kind of, very shifty-eyed, like, skirting certain questions about when they can release any of this information that they know. It really seems like this is just impeachment part 3, quite clearly. And you know what's funny is the New York Times had this, they were talking about it, and they kept talking about Trump knew that there was a heavily armed crowd approaching the Capitol. Now, it remains true that they've arrested 1,000 people who were in the Capitol, and there were 0 weapons charges for people in the Capitol. Yes. And I looked up a fact check on this just to see what they had to say. And they're like, this is not true. Like, someone was arrested in Virginia who was heading over there, and he had left his pistol in his car. Someone else was arrested on Capitol grounds carrying, something or another. Now, yeah, it's true. Some people were arrested for weapons charges outside. That's not the same thing as like an armed militia trying to take over a federal building. So it's just, they're really pushing this. They're pushing this line very heavily.
I mean, on the MSNBC pod that I was listening to, I can't remember which of their talk. It was, it was Maddow and Joy Reid and so forth. And one of them, whom I can't.
Nicole Wallace.
Yeah. I can't remember who was saying this, but it was like, Cassidy Hutchinson is going to have to come up with a new goal for the rest of her 80 years of life, because she's already achieved historic national significance. And right, I mean, look, I am willing to be shown like, other evidence to the contrary or something. But it seems like even what they're insinuating is basically that like Trump was. So, I mean, you're right that it's impeachment part 3, and in that impeachment part 2 was already about this. This was what it was. It was like a single article of impeachment. He gave this speech. He said like people should fight, by which he obviously meant like you should really, argue hard for protest and argue hard. And then this riot happened, and therefore he's guilty of inciting it and so forth. And so this whole thing is designed essentially to insinuate that from the moment he showed up, like from days in advance, he was scheming, rubbing his hands together, and there are these quotes from Meadows and the various people in the administration, like things could get really crazy on the 6th, so watch out. It's like, what do you think that meant, right? Like, so right. I mean, I don't know. Do you think that they'll get anything out of this? Any tangible political gain to the effect of like interfering with him if he tries to run in 2024 or anything?
I think they'll try. I mean, I think that's obviously, this is their goal. This is what they want to do. They don't have anything else. They literally have nothing else. The economy is heading into like probably a recession. Right. Inflation is insane. They can laugh at people who worry about buying gas as much as they want, but I don't see how that's a very successful strategy. Like, they clearly have a senile, demented leader. I don't know. I guess they're trying to get us into a war.
Right.
So this is all they have. But from what I gather, it's not really taking.
No.
I mean, I don't know if you saw, like last week they had some poll worker who claimed that she and her mother had been harassed by Trump supporters, and they tried to make a citizen's arrest.
Right.
I mean, and this was at the time, all of the Rachel Maddows and all those people were talking about she should be given the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Yeah.
We should, I mean, all this stuff. And she just disappeared from sight. None of this sticks.
Well, I mean,
none of it works.
Right. No, I think that's got to be. I mean, we've been saying for a while that there's just nothing in their arsenal. Everything is so disastrous about this administration. And never mind even Trump. Like what I think is kind of wild is, they're trying to hamstring Trump. Okay, but look at the polling numbers, and I hate to jinx it or whatever, but I just think November is going to be kind of like a nuclear bomb for them. In which case, like all of the stuff that's being just currently talked about and decided in the Supreme Court, like at least hypothetically, if we elect like legislators who can actually give a rat's and can do stuff, like there's sort of the sky is sort of the limit, and so yeah, I think they're running scared. I think like this doesn't even seem to be landing with like regular run of the mill lefties who, right, like everybody has to use gas in their car, everybody has to buy food. Like at a certain point, this really has got to wear thin, right? I mean, maybe I'm just being too naive, but it doesn't seem good for the Dems, at least at the moment.
Well, it'll be interesting to see the poll numbers in a week or two to see how this how the abortion stuff is playing.
Do you think it'll be a drawback for the right?
I don't think I think there's a big question.
Yeah.
Look, the left, like the pro-choice people, the pro-abortion people, the single issue voters on both sides already vote, right?
Right.
This is surely going to raise a lot of money for the Dems. This is like big donor class issue stuff.
So people will be like, put us back in, and yeah.
But whether that's going to energize, it'll probably increase turnout. Like Democratic turnout would have been like abysmal.
Yeah.
So they'll probably get more turnout, but the Republicans will also get turnout. So I don't know.
It'll be nuts, that's for sure. I think that's the one prediction that's guaranteed. It'll be a little crazy. Although, I would like to say on record, and maybe I'll say this and then immediately log off and realize that I'm being terribly disproven, but like I was sort of shamefacedly optimistic about the left burning the country down if Dobbs turned out the way it seemed like it was going to turn out, because I thought that they had kind of shot their wad with the leak and that all the screaming, they'd already gotten out all the screaming. And I don't know. I think that was kind of true. Like there's been some rioting, there's no question, but like it's nothing like 2020 or anything like that. Like they didn't really manage to gin people up.
Well, I mean, look who is going to. I mean, who are we talking about here? I mean, baby boomer women in college.
It's literally the people on those TikToks you're always sending me. It's exactly those people. Yeah,
it's like people who scream, but they're not going to. I mean, they're not going to go violently like burn stuff down. I mean, I think there's some Antifa types who are trying to rile this stuff up, but
right. Well,
they would like to see everything burned down all the time.
Exactly. Well, just we're sitting here laughing about this, but just wait, Seth. Just wait until the Wiccans start gathering for hexing.
Look, I have no doubt that there are some witches casting some like evil spells
on you and me by name. I bet we're like on the list.
Could be. Yeah. I mean, could be. I have no doubt that this is like a major witchy time, but as far as actual burning stuff down, I don't know about that.
Yeah, not unless the spells actually take. Good. Okay. Well, this was lots of fun, Seth. Thank you for flying. What's the word? Flying wingman? I don't know if that's like a thing. What's the flying in tandem? That's it. Flying in tandem.
Yeah.
There we go. I was struggling to come up with the appropriate Top Gun metaphor, but we got there in the end, and we will see all of you guys next week. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate, and don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I can't remember if I said this last week or not, but we hit 1,000 reviews on Apple Podcasts, and it's an average of, I think, 4.8 or something, so pretty darn good. And we're very, very grateful to all of you that did that. It really does help people to find the show in the algorithms and so forth. You can do it now on Spotify too. So if you'd like to help us out, that's one great way to do it, and tell people about the show as well. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.